All right, Emily, what's on your radar?
Well, Congress can't agree on what constitutes infrastructure. We're bungling vaccine rollouts. Journalists stop digging when the narrative is deemed conspiratorial. Medical progress is hitting new roadblocks. Our decadent ruling class is playing games with esoteric jargon to burnish their own reputations at great cost to everyone else. These concepts are their intellectual playthings, SAT words to be batted around in cozy progressive bubbles where performative cultural leftism is a powerful currency. But their talk has consequences, and those consequences don't comport with their utopian visions of social justice. Our institutions are increasingly saddled with the decadent baggage of squabbling elites, crippling our efficiency for the sake of faux virtuosity. There's a secret support group for a dozen successful progressive doctors terrified of creeping leftist extremism in their industry. We know that thanks to journalist Katie Herzog, who just reported on the group for Barry Weiss's Substack. The doctors, according to Herzog, meet once a month over Zoom to discuss the rapid spread of a deeply illiberal ideology in the country's most important medical institutions, as Herzog put it. They're alarmed by the dogma currently spreading throughout medical schools and hospitals, she wrote. Quote, "These aren't secret bigots who long for the good old days that were bad for so many. They are largely politically progressive, and they are the first to say that there are inequities in medicine that must be addressed," Herzog noted. "I've heard from doctors who've been reported to their departments for criticizing residents for being late. It was seen by their trainees as an act of racism. I've heard from doctors who've stopped giving trainees honest feedback for fear of retaliation. I've spoken to those who have seen clinicians and residents refuse to treat patients based on their race or their perceived conservative politics," she wrote, reporting that doctors fear a, quote, "purge" and believe, quote, "whole areas of research are off limits." Now, there's a lot to break down here. The bad science, the ideological monopoly that creates the bad science, the counterproductive impact on disenfranchised people. What I want to focus on now is the disproportionate blow to efficiency this culture is wreaking. There's a crucial quote from Herzog's excellent report attributed to a doctor from the Northwest. Quote, "In healthcare, innovation depends on open, objective inquiry into complex problems. But that's now undermined by this simplistic and racialized worldview where racism is seen as the cause of all disparities, despite robust data showing it's not that simple." There you have it. Doctors are intimidating their colleagues out of giving patients better treatment based on extreme notions of social justice that crumble in practice. This example is an unsettling one because it involves safety. But imagine how many resources our schools and companies and civic groups dedicate to hollow and counterproductive initiatives, then the conflicts over those initiatives, to get a little meta here, that could have gone right into people's pockets or schedules or better priorities. It's much worse when you realize that much of this time suck is orchestrated by educated progressive elites who perform their politics to enhance their own power. It reminds me of Bill Maher's reaction to the yanking of Dr. Seuss books. Quote, "You're not going to win the battle for the 21st century if you are a silly people, and Americans are a silly people," Maher said. "You know who doesn't care there's a stereotype of a Chinese man in a Dr. Seuss book? China," said Maher. Meanwhile, he added, "America has had Infrastructure Week every week since 2009, but we never do anything." That line took on new meaning when the Biden-era infrastructure negotiations really fired up, and it became clear that a huge sticking point to reaching an agreement necessary to pass the legislation that would legitimately make improvements, tangible improvements, to our infrastructure was the definition of infrastructure itself. Everything became infrastructure. It was a meme. Remember this classic Kirsten Gillibrand tweet? Biden's infrastructure plan was strategically stuffed with social justice priorities that at best would fall under a gargantuan, generously gargantuan umbrella definition of the word infrastructure. Republicans reacted immediately in opposition, while some progressives urged Biden to push further. Now, a CDC committee tasked with developing an ethical framework for the rollout of COVID vaccines, quote, openly acknowledged that its initial plan would result in more deaths than, quote, vaccinating older adults first, according to the Washington Free Beacon. But the panel said the plan would reduce racial disparities, something they deemed more important than saving lives, because essential workers, unlike adults over 65, are disproportionately Black and Hispanic, the two groups that have borne the brunt of the pandemic, according to the Beacon. Now, consider also that journalist groupthink on the lab leak hypothesis generated a costly lack of curiosity from the Fourth Estate for a year, kneecapping our free press's ability to do its job and shed light on corruption so that we can address it. When it comes to COVID, that's actually pretty urgent, given that a new pandemic could hit us at any moment. Sadly, from women's health to education, there are many more examples where these came from. Let it be noted that racism persists and must be a priority. Sexism too. Let it also be noted that groupthink stamps out free expression, and free expression is what sharpens arguments and policies. Without it, when the progressive or bigot binary formulation intimidates or persuades the ruling class into enforcing one worldview, you get a bad intellectual product. That bad intellectual product is now in charge. And it's crippling our efficiency when it comes to meeting basic societal needs like building safe roads and getting safe treatment from our doctors. Ryan, when you think about how actually these sort of esoteric conversations that happen in academic jargon are starting to have very tangible consequences on our institutions, it's kind of disturbing. I think it happened pretty quickly, and this has always been there to some extent, but I think the sort of immediate consequences downstream of it have started to come into focus in a really disturbing way, where you have doctors saying, like, listen, we're not examining certain things because we're terrified of being fired and losing our jobs and our careers. And you have, you look at what happened with infrastructure negotiations, you look at what happened with the lab leak hypothesis. Am I off base here, as someone on the left, am I overestimating the effect that this sort of decadence is having on our institutions, or is this something that's very real?
I think you're off on including the infrastructure talks in that. We could talk about that in a second, because I think that has a completely different valence, and it's about partisanship, et cetera. But I do think that you're right on the other point, in that we were talking in the opening segment about China and how its ability to investigate the cause of and the origin of the pandemic is a crucial test for it, because you have to be able to have some intellectual integrity and rigor in your government. Otherwise, you're going to pursue policies, and you're going to build structures, both systemic structures and also actual structures that collapse under the weight of reality if you're trying to conform to some idealistic or fantastical or ideological view rather than reality. And the Chinese system, because it disincentivizes lower level officials from being honest with their superiors and all the way up the chain, inhibits their ability to innovate effectively and to gather the right accurate information in order to make the right decisions.
Right.
The U.S. is at a risk of creating a different version of that. If people feel like, this could be an interesting avenue of intellectual or scientific inquiry, but if I'm wrong about it, there's nothing but cost for me.
Even if you're right about it.
Even if I'm right about it.
Right.
That being right sometimes is more dangerous to your career than being wrong. Then the cost to the country and to the world in discoveries not found and to innovations not innovated, it will be profound.
Right. And I will concede that the infrastructure negotiations did not fall apart solely because of this question of identity politics or whatever, social justice. But I do think there's immense pressure on the left from the sort of people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to ensure that any infrastructure package is really stuffed, that this definition of infrastructure is appropriately broad, because in a sort of leftist academic sense, yes, everything really is infrastructure, and you can kind of make that argument, but the sort of actual ability that we have to fix our roads and our freaking bridges is probably a higher priority in this sense than stuffing a bill and making it, like, just gumming up the process by having to debate all of these different social justice questions, earning more ill will with Republicans by doing it. It just makes the process all that more difficult. So that's why I included it as an example. Right. But I'm curious about your rebuttal.
My point would be that if Democrats didn't have the filibuster to contend with, then they wouldn't be doing all these gymnastics to try to figure out what is infrastructure, because the infrastructure package is headed towards reconciliation, which means it only needs a majority vote in the Senate, and they know they get one bite or two maybe at this apple, and they remember what happened in 2009 and 10. Once the window closed, they were done governing for years, and so they want to get all of their priorities into this package. Interestingly, the left and center left are kind of moving in parallel paths. You've got the tendency that you've talked about, which is becoming hegemonic in a lot of places. Yet the actual policies that Democrats are pushing in Congress are these universal or almost universal policies that are multiracial, like child tax credits, unemployment benefits, like direct checks. Like their actual agenda is popular and universal. But the intellectual edifice is not. It's interesting. No, that is really interesting. And it actually, I think, kind of supports the thesis that I just laid out, which is, why is the edifice unpopular? And I would say because it's been framed with such a divisive framework, right? Like, it's just been injected into the discourse with this divisive, unpopular, and I think incorrect framework of social justice that actually, and social justice on its own is a great thing, right? Like, that's a great concept. But when you frame it in this very divisive way, and you have to sort of have these conversations when it comes to doctors literally being afraid to investigate certain areas of inquiry that are important to our health. Or Katie Herzog laid out an example where there was a social justice group that recommended removing police from emergency rooms. And she asked a doctor who said in urban areas that would be disastrous. There was a time, this doctor said, when a gang member came back to finish the job on a guy they were treating, and had the police not been there, it would have been a nightmare. And so when you have this sort of this ideology that is very much an ideology, is very much the sort of esoteric academic ideology that came out of these sort of radical leftist circles, and you start to apply it to practical questions of efficiency and our ability to get stuff done for taxpayers, I feel like we're really operating under the weight of that right now. Right, and the last point I'd make is that it also produces a vicious cycle because it empowers the most idiotic racists on the right. And we're talking later about this Texas 1836 project. And so complete nonsense, completely ahistorical. And then that fuels the folks back on the left, and you just keep flushing all the way down.
And I am glad that once again we have arrived at agreement at the end of this conversation. I think that is absolutely accurate. And when I got meta in the radar, that's what I was talking about, is that now we then get mired in the conflicts over the conflicts. And it is a vicious cycle. It's completely distracting and unnecessary. And if we could sort of find a way to get past it, we could then do the Herculean task of getting stuff done, of actually figuring out how to repair our roads and bridges and do things for our people. But I don't have any confidence that's going to happen anytime soon. But Team Rising joins us next, so stick with us for that.